Hello and on to Community Justice Innovation Module 2. This week we're going to dig into the concept of restorative justice, where it came from and some of the different thinkers in the area. And I know there'll be a certain number of students among you who go, oh God, with theory, groan. But this is an area where the theorists are very important. I'm not saying they're not important in other areas, but we're seeing an interesting area where practice is emerging at the same time as theory, and there's this interlinked relationship between emerging new ideas and new innovations and the development of theories to support, test and critique those theories. So often when we study theory, it's something in the past, and it's something that we see as, you know, more of a history exercise than anything else. But in this area, I think it's very important to see the ways in which we see a partnership, and not always a very entirely friendly one, but generally a partnership between the practitioners who are developing new ideas and new ways of doing things, and then the thinkers, the theorists, the critics, who are trying to provide the foundation, the support for why things work. And quite a lot of community-based innovations start with an individual who is very inspired, selfless, comes up with a great program, but they're not going to sit around and wait for the academics and the theorists to develop the theory about what they're doing. The practice comes first. And then there's a need, in order to evaluate and improve on practice, to have people coming in and examining it and looking at the evidence, and then trying to develop an understanding of why certain things work and don't. So I think this is an interesting example where theory is not this sort of here is this golden books that have laid down in the past of great theorists, and this is where we're seeing this ongoing back and forth between the development of innovation and the intellectual grunt work of trying to understand what's going on. So one of the things we're going to talk about is this concept of restorative justice. We will look at several different ideas that underpin community justice throughout the term, but restorative justice is one of the big ones. And it's a change from ideas of traditional justice that are really formed around the idea of punishment, and punishment as just desserts, that people break the law and they deserve punishment. And there are other, criminology theory will have taught you all different variations on this, but a lot of it is very much based on the state, and it's based on the offender, and whether they're punished because they deserve it, or it's because it's seen as a way of deterring crime, or even sometimes rehabilitating them. It's all very much focused just on the relationship between the individual offender and the state, whereas these restorative justice ideas are much more about the offender and the victim, who is very much left out on the traditional system, and the surrounding community. And the clue's in its name. It's about restoring as much as possible the harm that is done by the criminal action. And some of the definitions here are kind of at odds with things that I've learned as a lawyer, but then again, criminologists may say, well, that's because I'm part of the problem, not the solution, that I'm someone who is invested in the idea of the state and the law as the center of the system. And I agree that my training was very much in that field. But when we come back to it, we'll look at how these different theorists and different ideas have sought to build this theoretical superstructure that challenges these old ideas. And when we say old ideas, they're only a couple of 100 years old, but the old ideas that it's all about the state, it's all about government, it's all about prosecution and the courts, and saying, well, let's look at different ways of thinking about crime and the consequences of crime. Now, I'm going to refer to quite a few theorists in here. Their details are all in the readings for this week, if you need to follow them up. So let's start with a few theorists who were involved in the foundation of this idea and the context this came out of. So restorative justice is a creation of the 1970s, like me. You can stop laughing now. But it was a time when the conventional criminal justice system really was in trouble. We were seeing increasing crime rates, escalating crime rates across the board, and nothing that was being done within the criminal justice system was really working all that well. And worse yet, victims were very much feeling used by the system. You know, a victim can be compelled to come along and give evidence at a trial, but they get nothing out of it. You know, and a victim who says, well, I have to take time off work to come along and give, you know, like any other witness, give evidence at a trial. I've got to hang around in a courtroom all day waiting for my turn, and sometimes there's all sorts of delays behind the scene, and I'm sitting around waiting around to come in. And at the end of the day, it's like, okay, thanks, victim, off you go. And you know, they never hear anything else. They never formally hear about the outcome of a trial. If they're lucky and the police officer in charge of the case, who may not be the original police officer, by the time it's come to trial, it could be someone else, they may contact them and let them know what the outcome of the trial is. And certainly there's no formal notification of sentencing, and there's definitely no notification if the offender goes into a custodial sentence of when that person's going to be released. So there's a big build-up of pressure behind the victims movement in the 1970s too, and victims saying, look, we don't ask for a lot, but we would like to be able to have a say in the process, or at least have our voice heard. We'd like to not be just treated like, you know, a part of the machinery. It'd be nice if we got some restitution out of the process, but honestly, most offenders don't have resources. That's why they end up as offenders. But sometimes you get wealthy offenders and are capable of paying restitution. And certainly we'd like to be kept more informed about what goes on. So there's a rise in the victims movement at the same time as restorative justice. All right. So the first one I want to mention is Albert Eglash, who's a criminologist, a psychologist actually, who worked with young offenders. And he's the one who came up with the term restorative justice. He coined the term. And he drew a line in the sand between what he described as retributive justice, which is the law of the state, and restorative justice. And retributive justice is all about punishment. It's all about punishing offenders. And restorative justice is a different way of thinking about things, where it's about, as far as you can, restoring the position of the victim and helping, you know, the victim overcome the trauma of the crime and providing solutions and help for them. And, you know, some of the things that you don't even know about in terms of things like crime scene cleaners. I mean, you may have seen Little Miss Sunshine, about a family that runs a business of crime scene cleanup. That, you know, where there's physical damage to your property, where there's possibly like blood stains or whatever else, that it's usually up to the victim to sort all that stuff out. And people who are already shell-shocked by being involved in as a victim of crime can be quite shocked as to how much the state just doesn't help, is not involved. And if you think about the United States, where there's no universal health care, if you get injured by an offender, you're then on your own for your own health insurance or pay your costs as a consequence of that crime. So what Eglash says is that the whole focus of the old style system, and this is not entirely consistent with what I think as a lawyer, is focused on retribution. And I would say that it's focused on more than retribution. It's very much focused on ideas like deterrence and ideas like rehabilitation. But I do agree with Eglash that at the end of the day, those state systems it's all about me. It's all about the state system, and they really, really don't care about, you know, the context of the crime. It's about processing, and often it's very administrative. It's about, we've got to process X number of offenders, we've got to get them through the system, and we've got to get an outcome at the end of the day. All right, the next theorist I'm going to bring up briefly is Randy Barnett. He's a lawyer, again from the United States, And his contribution here is to push this idea a little further. And he's had one of those sort of, thoughtful scratch your chin moments of saying, well, how come the crime is considered to be against the state and not the individual? So he was involved in the rise of the victims' rights movement, and very much saying, in the United States, it's the people of the United States against Smith, or in the English or Australian tradition, it's the Crown, it's against Smith. Why is it in civil trials it's the applicant against the defendant, it's the litigant against the person who they're suing? How come the state gets to jump in and say, okay, it's all about me now? This is an important stage towards where we're going to head it in a couple of theorists. But he first raised that idea of how come the state gets to be the centre of attention here? Why is it the victim gets pushed to the side? The next theorist I want to bring up is Howard Zehr, Z-E-H-R. He's a criminologist, and he brought up the idea of changing lenses. I think his book is called Changing Lenses, and he talks about that paradigm shift of moving away from that state-centric, state-focused idea of what crime is, and just maybe we don't have to change things an awful lot, but maybe we just have to change the way we think about it. And we spend an awful lot of money on policing. We spend an awful lot of money on corrections, on prisons. Maybe we don't have to throw it all away and reinvent the system. Maybe we just have to change the way we're thinking. So when he talks about changing lenses, he says, people are threatened by this idea of wholesale change and changing a system, throwing it all away and starting again. And what if we do the wrong thing and whatever? And he says, well, maybe we don't have to. Maybe we just have to change the way we think. And he really has predicted the way change has occurred. It's occurred in a very incremental way. And even down to the fact that we have community corrections officers these days. I think their outlook and their perspective is very much community oriented compared to the way they were in the past. And in fact, and this might be relevant to you guys, one of the woes of the Community Corrections Administration is, also they tell me, is that they find it really hard to find the right people to work in community corrections, because they say that when they advertise for jobs there, most of the applicants they get are very much hardline punishment oriented people. They're, the old-fashioned, they break the law, they need to be punished, and until they learn to do the right thing. And they're saying that what they really want as community corrections officers are people who are from this restorative perspective, who are really focused on, putting this person back into the community, helping them make amends, helping the community heal after the incident. So I think Zehr's idea of changing lenses is important to bring up here. And when we're talking about innovation, is that it is often too easy to think about, CDs came along and we threw away records, and then MP3 players came along and we threw away our CDs, and then phones with MP3 capability came away and we got rid of our MP3 players. And ignore the fact that people are still buying vinyl, ignore the fact that often the changes are not these wholesale revolutions, they're matters of degree. And I think Zehr is very cluey in picking that that's the way of the future. That we're not really going to be in a position to say we're doing away with prisons tomorrow, no more prisons. There's all sorts of reasons why that's not going to work, particularly from the community perspective. But we can change the way in which we see prisons and the way in which we use prisons, and we can gradually change that perspective overall. All right. The next theorist I want to bring up is Niels Christie, and he pushes this. He's Norwegian. He's a criminologist, and he came up with this idea of conflicts as property. And this is quite fascinating. He takes that idea of why is it the state substitutes itself in, pushes itself in and says, pushes the victim out of the context and says, okay, it's all about us now. And he says that conflicts are actually very, very valuable. We don't like conflicts, and conflicts do terrible things in society. But to be in the position where you are resolving conflicts and you're in that role of being in the middle of it all and responsible for it all, that's actually a very extremely valuable form of social capital. And this is the explanation for why the state, all the way back from sort of tribal chieftains through to modern society, is so keen to, even at great cost, be stuck right in the middle of this and to displace victims and displace the community, is because there's a whole lot of valuable property, a whole lot of, he doesn't use the term social capital, but I'd use the term social capital, tied in with being the responsible for adjudicating. And you can do other things with that power as well. So you can use other forms of social control to control subcultures. You can deem a subculture to be a criminal subculture, and to say, while we're at it, we're going to punish this person for an offence, and while we're at it, anyone who wears baggy jeans, we're going to deem to be a criminal, and that's going to allow us to police people and police subcultures, because we can actually, I'm not sure what it is that today is seen as the criminal style. But in the 90s, it was very much, the hip hop, pants about to fall off kind of look, which did have its origins in prison, because prisons take away people's belts so they can't self-harm, and then give people clothing that doesn't fit very, very well. So it was an interesting loop, but it was one of those things that the state was able to, in its role as the criminal justice system, overreach its power and start saying, well, we're going to criminalise certain forms of dress, certain forms of expression, certain sorts of communities, certain sorts of music. Not directly, but we're going to link all these things to crime and use that as a form of social control. So Christie's really interesting, because it then asks, well, what do we do as a replacement? And who gets the value out of resolving conflicts? Who gets to own that? And obviously one of the participants who needs a sense of ownership restored is the victims. And Christie really did push this idea of, like, victims are having these conflicts stolen from them. Something bad's happened to them. They have an interest in value in having that restored. And the state comes in and says, no, you're just a special witness. We're the ones who get to make decisions, and we get to make decisions that benefit us in terms of the outcomes for offenders. So I think these guys are really interesting. There's a lot of people who work in this field. It's still one of the more vibrant areas of criminology research. There's been a lot of big claims made around restorative justice. One of which that's been particularly challenged is this idea that restorative justice is linked to very old forms of justice, and that basically it's an indigenous form of justice, and therefore it is better than the retributive, whatever you want to call it, state justice, because it has these origins in these ancient traditions. And Kathleen Daly is a theorist who's been quite vigorous in challenging that and saying that that's just a real oversimplification of the situation, and it's really not possible because society is complex and changing, just to say that, oh, well, all the old systems before we had a modern state used restorative justice, therefore that's the better way of doing things. So Daly's not opposed to restorative justice, but she's opposed to people for whom it was a bit of a bandwagon. It was a bit of a, like, oh, we're all into restorative justice now, and we're all going to, say this is great and this is the better way of doing things, because it goes back to, the Bible, and it goes back to indigenous cultures, and it goes back to all these other things, because there just simply isn't that proof. All right. What else do we need to talk about in terms of restorative justice? Be aware of the dichotomy of retributive justice and restorative justice all the way through the literature. As I've said, it's from a legal perspective, it's much more complicated than that, because the old system doesn't just use retribution. In fact, retribution is from a legal perspective, one of the least important parts of the system. And we'll find that things like deterrence are actually much, much stronger ideas in the legal system than retribution, and about as ineffective too. We've never really proven that there's any kind of deterrent factor for various reasons, and again, you've probably covered all this in criminological theory already, so I won't go over it again, but I just want to, I guess, say that when people are comparing restorative justice to retributive justice, that it's not just retribution. There's a whole lot of things that are tied into the traditional conventional justice system. All right. What else need I say about this? In terms of how restorative justice is different from, let's say, conventional justice system, Zia and Mika, again, in your notes, say there are 3 elements of restorative justice that will separate it from the old system. The first is that crime is fundamental. This is going well, isn't it? The first is that key element is that crime is fundamentally a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. It's not a crime against the state. It's not a crime against society. It's a crime against people and the relationships between them. The second element of the theory is that this violation creates obligations and liabilities. Pretty much the same approach as civil law does, that you harm someone else, you harm their property, you harm whatever, then there's an obligation on you to do something about that. And the third element they raise is that restorative justice seeks to heal and put things right from wrong. So again, a little bit more like the conventional legal system. It's about evaluating damages and finding ways of fixing those things. Obviously, though, if you're going to sue someone in a civil court, you are only going to do that if they have resources that are worth suing them for. And usually in criminal cases, the actual offenders, don't have resources. That's how they end up in a criminal career path. But we can then expand the idea of the state involvement and saying that the state has to have much more involvement in care of the victim, in providing for the victim, at least cleaning the blood up in the victim's home, providing extended support, and so on. So again, a resource taxed criminal justice system, a lot of people don't like this idea because it's going to cost more. But from a welfare perspective and an understanding of society, it's like, well, the most important person really should be the victim. The offender's quite important too, because we don't want the offender to come out of the system more likely to commit offences. So we have a focus on the offender there as well, not because we, feel an obligation to the offender, but we, or maybe we do. Maybe the reason the offender is an offender is because society has failed them, that they're in a position where social systems have pushed them in that position. So there is an importance there on restoration in terms of rehabilitation of the offender. But the real primary focus is the victim and the community. How can we fix what's going on? All right. There's a little bit of a debate about whether restorative justice is punishment or not punishment. For me, this is just semantics. I find this quite boring. But occasionally people say, well, restorative justice isn't punishment because it's not based on these retributive ideas. My response to that would be neither is deterrence. Like, we still call when we apply the criminal justice system to deter others, we still call it punishment, even though we're not thinking in terms of retribution. I think punishment is just it's just a case of the word that we conventionally use isn't exactly right. We tend to use the word corrections more than punishment now. But again, corrections is also very value laden. And I think you can go crazy spending all your time trying to find a better word for things. And unfortunately, particularly in the progressive side of politics, I think there's an awful lot of time and energy spent on semantics and what the right word is to use, and then punishing people who don't, shaming people who aren't in the know as to what the current correct term is to use. And my preference personally is to actually see some action rather than debate over the words that are used. So yes, the criminal justice system talks about punishment all the time. It's been a long while since, it's been hundreds of years since we thought of the system purely in terms of punishment. Yes, the more modern term is corrections. I think that's a conventional okay term. I know there's all sorts of, there's problems with using the term corrections in terms of who gets to be correct and who's not correct and whatever. But I think corrections is fine. But there are people who spend a lot of time saying, well, if it's restorative justice, we can't call it punishment, we can't call it corrections, we've got to call it something else. From my point of view, let's fix the system first and worry about what we call it later. But a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about what the right words are. So it might be me that's in the wrong. Anyway, there's this whole debate about whether restorative justice is punishment. Can it be called can it be called punishment? To me, call it what you like, as long as you start innovating and fixing the system. The last thing I want to mention is, again, it's this semantics thing, is there's ongoing controversy over how restorative justice is to be defined. Like any of these areas, you put 5 academics in a room, you'll get 10 different opinions. But we do have 2 different ideas of restorative justice that we use: the so-called purist definition and the maximalist definition. So I just want to bring these up to you to think about, because these are, when someone says restorative justice, they can mean one of these 2 things or any of the shades of grey in between. So the purist definition, and this is associated with Tony Marshall, again in your notes, says that restorative justice is a process whereby parties with a stake in a specific offence collectively resolve how to deal with the aftermath of the offence and its implications for the future. So it really focuses on this problem-solving approach that brings everyone together, brings the community victim offender together to come up with a solution. Now, a lot of people find that definition to be way too narrow, because it really does apply to things like victim offender mediation. And victim offender mediation isn't used very often. It probably could be used a lot more than it is, but it's also a voluntary process. So there's a lot of people, particularly offenders, who don't want to be involved in it. It's interesting, there are more victims who want to be part of mediation than there are offenders. Offenders are like, no, just send me to court. I don't care. I don't want to have to see the victim again. And I think that's kind of interesting, that they seem to be more scared of the process than the victims are. But this purist definition would exclude much of what's going on. So things like, I keep coming back to community corrections, which is on my mind at the moment, I guess because I've been talking to some of the folks there. But it would exclude that. It would exclude anything that involved trial and the state and everything else. At the other extreme, we have the maximalist definition. This is Bazemore and Walgrave, again, in your notes. And they say restorative justice is every action that is primarily oriented toward doing justice by repairing the harm that is caused by the crime. So much, much wider. Doesn't have to involve the community, victim offender, everyone getting together or any of those specifics. But it's basically any process that is oriented towards fixing the harm rather than looking at, the liability to the state for breaking the law. So even just, in our, having publicly accessible healthcare, as we have in Australia, is a form of restorative justice compared to the American system. And there's a lot of Americans who would see a lot of benefit of having public entitlement to healthcare, who are, victims of crime, who then have to pay for their medical treatment. And definitely our community corrections folk would fall under that category, because the lens through which they see their work and what they do is very much focused on reintegrating the community, coming up with better solutions, stopping the offender offending again, and so on. So we've got these two different ends of the scale. One is this very narrow focused on community action being actually about members of the community getting involved and fixing the problem. The other is saying, well, anything which pushes us towards focusing on the offender and the harm that's done is realistically restorative justice. Now, later in the term, we're going to come back to these definitions again. Oh joy, I hear you say, more definitions. But we're going to look at the concept of therapeutic jurisprudence, which is a sort of a merger of law, public health, and medicine. At the end of the day, it's very similar to restorative justice in the sorts of things it proposes. But again, its fundamental position it comes from is about healing rather than punishment. But I'm just flagging that as something that we're going to talk about in the future. And you may see reference to therapeutic jurisprudence throughout. I don't think it's really all that different, but as I think you've probably guessed from the way I've spoken about this issue, I am more of a practical, practitioner-oriented person who sees the value of theory, but also is often quite exasperated by, small groups of people at conferences arguing vehemently and publishing in journals that 2 or 3 people read about minor semantic differences in terms. And I'm much happier to say, let's go with a theory, a description that works for us, and let's argue about the details later on. All right, so these are some themes to unpack and that we'll be talking about in the workshop this week and in your learning logs.